But how is it that we allow 7 out of 10 children in our country to feel like they don't have enough 30 years after the so-called miracle of democracy in South Africa? In the spirit of Tambo, may we pass through those terrible but cleansing fires, find the courage to radically criticize the status quo, but also find the competence and the imagination to reimagine our society thereafter. We are obliged, we are duty-bound to do whatever we can to free ourselves of this crime. The capacity to be candid, to be honest, to be open, and not to lie to the people. Program directors, I return you many thanks, and to the Tambo family, Auntie Tembi, to members of the academic staff here, my fellow academic colleagues, the Tambo Foundation, and my parents. I must also tell you a funny story as I mentioned the Tambo family and my parents. The other day someone stopped me and they said, "I know you." And I said, okay, now I know what's coming. And they said, "You are Dali Tambo's son." So I said, no, it's the other Dali, but yeah. So I suppose it's only fitting that I should be delivering this lecture here. We're gathered here today to reflect on the life of Oliver Tambo and his vision, but also the future of just leadership in South Africa. Now, Tambo's life is a life that is dazzling and extensive in its sheer scale and scope. From student to teacher, from teacher to lawyer, from lawyer to activist, from activist to freedom fighter, from freedom fighter to commander-in-chief of a revolutionary army and diplomat and exiled leader, and finally to Shakespearean returning hero. So with a life that extends across such breadth, it is impossible to reflect on it in its full complexity. So today, I've chosen to focus on 3 key aspects of Tambo's life and legacy that I believe are particularly relevant for our times, and indeed for the future of leadership in South Africa. Those are, firstly, Tambo as a radical critic, someone who is unafraid to tell the truth and to call a thing, particularly a radical critic of apartheid. Secondly, I'd like to reflect on Tambo as a lawgiver, as someone who played a fundamental role in shaping the law of South Africa, particularly in birthing the South African Constitution. And finally, I'd like to reflect on Tambo's legacy as a statesman and an international relations actor, someone who was able to balance between tricky tides of geopolitics, balance between East and a warring West, understand the complexities of Africa, the United Nations, and traverse all of those difficult grounds towards building a South Africa and its liberation foreign policy that ultimately met the needs of the passage to democracy in South Africa. In sum, then, I believe it's important for us to extract from Tambo's legacy both the capacity to radically criticize, but then to do the work of radically building after we have criticized. And Tambo is an exemplar of both the capacity to radically critique and to creatively reimagine. So let's talk about the radical critique, because it bears calling to mind Tambo's words themselves. As I've prepared for this lecture, I've been immersed in the archive of Tambo's speeches, his readings, his interviews, and his documents. I've spoken to people who I look up to and trust who came across Tambo and his legacy. And one thing that stands out is just how unapologetically he was prepared and unwaveringly he was prepared to criticize the apartheid system. It may seem obvious now, but at the time, few were able to mount as unwavering a criticism, and we know the consequences. But have a look at this. In a speech at Georgetown University in the US in 1987, Tambo said, "To end the violence in our country and in Southern Africa as a whole means one thing and one thing only. The apartheid system has to be liquidated. It must be ended in its entirety. Correctly categorized by the international community as a crime against humanity, no part of the system can or should be left intact. A crime cannot be reformed or amended. It either is or it is not. It cannot be made tolerable by changes to any of the elements that make up its totality." Firstly, you witness the incredible intellect, the rhetorical ability, but the unwavering moral certitude and the refusal to entertain any compromise to the absolute liquidation of apartheid. What a refreshing corrective to the mealy-mouthed compromises which we have become so used to swallowing. In the mid-1980s, in an interview with the New African magazine, Tambo reaffirmed this golden thread that no aspect of apartheid could be tolerated, not even a small ounce. He said, "We aim to defeat and destroy the fascist regime, and not to reform apartheid, or to make our oppression less reprehensible." And a final glimpse into this unwavering stand, an uncompromising stance, came in an interview, again in the crucial mid to late 1980s, again in the United States. Jim Lehrer, a very well-known journalist who hosts what is currently now known as PBS NewsHour, hosted Tambo and an American senator in a debate about violence in South Africa. And listen to his response to the question which tried to put him on the back foot. Jim Lehrer says, "Mr. Tambo, the Minister of Law and Order said today that your organization is working at making South Africa ungovernable and uncontrollable. Is that true, Mr. Tambo?" Oliver Tambo, "It is true. We are the victims of a crime. The government is carrying on a crime, perpetuating a crime on our people. We have an obligation to stop the crime, to stop the operation of the apartheid system by making it unworkable. We have no alternative to that. We are obliged, we are duty-bound to do whatever we can to free ourselves of this crime." I think Mr. Lehrer moved on to another topic after that. These glimpses of Tambo's political thought reveal a mind that was incisive, that was insightful, but that was ultimately able to arrive at a moral conclusion and defend a position to the hilt. Something that is so refreshing, something that we require of leadership in our country today. The capacity to be candid, to be honest, to be open, and not to lie to the people. To stand firm on a principle, no matter who tries to knock you off that principle. And if there's one thing, or the first thing I believe we should distill from Tambo's legacy is that capacity to stand firm, to radically criticize the status quo. But Tambo didn't stop there. Because it's one thing to radically criticize the status quo, and it's an important thing to do. It's an important thing to do now. But he also did the hard work of crafting and imagining an alternative to that status quo, and becoming one of the chief lawgivers of the subsequent South African society. Now, a little known fact, on the north and south walls of the United States Supreme Court, there are marble frieze statues of the great lawgivers of human history. Figures like the Babylonian lawmaker Hammurabi, Moses, Solon, Draco, where the word draconian comes from, the unrelenting ancient lawgiver. The Prophet Muhammad, yes, in the US Supreme Court. Napoleon. And I would venture that were the US Supreme Court to recraft the north and south walls, they should add another important lawgiver, Tambo. Because it's one thing to practice the law. And make no mistake, Tambo practiced the law brilliantly as the first black South African, along with Mandela, to found a partnership of black lawyers in Johannesburg. A funny thing, I was reading In Our Lifetime by Eleanor Sisulu, and Walter Sisulu is asked, did Mandela and Tambo ever actually get legal permission to practice in Johannesburg at the time? And Sisulu said, no, I don't think they did. So Tambo was a brilliant practitioner of law. Everyone from George Bezos to Sidney Kentridge spoke about how fastidious he was, how thorough he was, and how he was able to even use apartheid law and the common law to secure small victories for black people at that time. But he was more than a lawyer or a legal practitioner, because towards the mid-1980s, he became a lawgiver, someone who imagines a just law for a new society. In 1985, at the ANC's Watershed Consultative Conference in Kabwe, Tambo did something paradoxical. Firstly, he stood up in front of the delegates and he said that terrible but cleansing fires would be required in revolutionary war to take South Africa to peace. In other words, terrible and cleansing fires through revolutionary war were all that would be able to get us to peace. So he intensified the armed struggle. But at the same time, that conference issued an instruction for a constitutional committee to be set up to imagine the constitution of a peaceful, democratic South Africa. Radically critiquing on the one hand and radically building on the other hand. We may think those look like contradictory positions, but they were just an illustration of Tambo's capacity to both extremely fight the system and think through how to rebuild that system. So the armed struggle was intensified, but the constitutional project was also intensified. And the Constitutional Committee, which Tambo established, was really one of the fundamental kernels of what would become the South African Constitution. But I would go a step further, because I would say that the constitution that Tambo was envisaging was a better constitution than the one we even got. Sadly, Tambo passed away at a critical juncture in our country when constitutional negotiations were at a pivotal state. And in some ways, the constitutional dream dreamt up by Tambo got diverted a little. What do I mean by that? Well, I want to give you a sense of Tambo's constitution, because this was the preamble to Tambo's constitution. In his brilliant book, Andre Odendaal, UWC historian, has traced back the Constitutional Committee and their work. And he has found early drafts of the preamble that was supposed to make up the South African Constitution. So let's see what Tambo's preamble sounded like. Draft 1, 8 to the 14th of January, 1986. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people. Freedom Charter nod, quite similar to where we are with our preamble. South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Then it goes on. Only a democratic state based on the will of all the people can secure all their birthright without distinction of color, race, sex, or belief. It continues. Grants to the oppressed majority their national rights. Grants to the oppressed majority their national rights. But just wait. Outlaws racial discrimination in all its forms. By the way, there's no such clause in our preamble today. We have an equality clause. It continues. Ensures the complete dismantlement of apartheid structures and their replacement by democratic ones. The word apartheid does not feature in the current South African Constitution. Prevents the resurgence of racist policies and programs, whether in their old form or new ones. Overcomes the effects of centuries of racial domination and inequality by ensuring a substantial redistribution of wealth and the complete opening up of access to facilities for all. That was Tambo's constitution. And somewhere along the line, while we retained a lot of that progress, and I don't mean to overlook the important gains made by the constitutional dispensation, we lost the radical revisioning of society that was contained in those early drafts of what the new South Africa was meant to be. So Tambo was no radical analyst alone. He was a remaker of South African society, and he was in the process of remaking South African laws and constitutional law in our country. The problem that we face today, in large part, is that we have lost that same political imagination to rethink our country and to break free of old assumptions and to try something new. It was Nietzsche who said, a snake that cannot cast its skin perishes. So too with those minds who are prevented from changing their views. They cease to be minds. What we can learn from Tambo as we try to reimagine the future is that we must be bold in our political imagination, and we must not allow the melodrama of today's pantomime news cycle to narrow our gaze, because we can still reimagine what reconstituting South Africa might look like. We might even start the early work towards thinking of what a new republic that takes the lessons of the old republic and builds on them further might look like. That would be Tambo's legacy. And of course, finally, and thirdly, we've spoken about his radical critique. We've spoken about his capacity as a lawgiver. We come to his ability as a statesman. Let's wrap our minds around this. Remember, the Cold War is raging. The Soviet Union and the United States are at loggerheads. And Tambo manages to navigate from exile, an ability to communicate eventually by the end of the 1980s with Washington, with London, and yes, with Western capitals. Of course, he lives much of his life, or he lives an important portion of his life in London. He also is in dialogue with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe at the time. He then manages to straddle Africa, not only in the frontline states, but building unity across the continent, which, by the way, is also afflicted by the Cold War at the time. He then penetrates the United Nations, playing a key role in the Special Committee Against Apartheid and forging anti-apartheid sentiment in the United Nations. This is a diplomatic achievement, an unparalleled diplomatic achievement. Would that we could have someone in this global moment of rivalries between East and West, North and South, bickering on the African continent. Would that we could have someone who could put the South African people's interests at the center and negotiate with every pole of the global order so that we could achieve further liberation. That's what Tambo would demand of us. Not to say we're not speaking to anyone, we would speak to everyone. And we should speak to everyone. But we would stand firm on certain principles while speaking to everyone. Whether those principles are the plight of the Palestinian people in the war on Gaza, or whether those principles are domestic at home and the refusal to waver on the need for gender justice or racial justice in our country. We can have a foreign policy that stays true to those principles while balancing the different power blocks in the world for the interests of South Africa. We just need to find it through the legacy of Tambo. So Tambo was able to criticize radically and build radically. And it all really comes down to one question. Can we build a just South Africa? I don't mean these flimsy definitions of justice where we're talking about court procedures, or the hollow version of justice where both sides get to be heard. Can we build a just South Africa? That is the question that Tambo's legacy is calling out to us at the moment. That legacy won't be built through PR exercises or dialogues. It may be built through dialogue. It will be built by going through terrible and cleansing fires of reckoning with the horror of our society and of dragging ourselves through the difficult decisions that have to be made so that we can pass through those terrible but cleansing fires. And we can recover. There was a lot of skepticism about foundations coming together to chart a way forward. But I do think there is one thing that can be recovered from the process of dialogue. Why don't we just have a national action? or agree on a national policy or a national step that we all want to take, rather than just a national place where we first discuss what we're going to do and then wait until we figure what that. Let's just choose one thing that all the foundations could come together behind, that society could come together behind, that academia could come together behind, that politicians and economists. Let's find one thing and do it, and then see what happens after that. Maybe that is something we can salvage from the process of our society coming together to try and find each other. We are a country of raw and untended traumas, lurking just beneath the surface. Tambo's hometown is one of the worst run municipalities in our country. 8 in 10 South Africans say they believe the country is going in the wrong direction. 8 in 10. But it's rare that you find a statistic that brings a tear to your eye. But this one nearly did for me. 70% of South African children live in poverty. 70% of South African children live in poverty as we speak. The numbers have just lurched upwards. Now we can quibble about how you define the poverty line and what's enough money to make sure that you have food in your mouth at the end of the month. But how is it that we allow 7 out of 10 children in our country to feel like they don't have enough 30 years after the so-called miracle of democracy in South Africa? So it's these difficult questions and these difficult truths which we must call to mind as we remember the legacy of Tambo and his capacity to speak the truth unapologetically, but call society to build and reimagine itself as we speak those truths. And so, in the spirit of Tambo, may we pass through those terrible but cleansing fires, find the courage to radically criticize the status quo, but also find the competence and the imagination to reimagine our society thereafter. Thank you.
Na 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 na